The scariest aspect of war and war crimes is the realization that the potential for such brutality rests dormant within each and every one of us. Disclaimer: war and evil are some of the most complex topics related to humanity. The purpose of this video is to explore those topics and spark a more thorough discussion in the comments. If there's anyone out there in the world that does have all the answers, it's certainly not me. In light of recent events, I decided to rewatch a film I didn't think I had the stomach to ever watch again: the highly acclaimed Soviet war film, Come and See. Come and See is universally regarded as one of the best war films ever made, and many people, myself included, would rank it as the best war film ever made. Come and See exists in the very rare category of non-horror films that are infinitely more terrifying and effective than 99% of their traditional horror counterparts, and I don't believe I'm being hyperbolic in saying that. Whereas the utility of terror in most horror films is limited to jump scares and goosebumps that fade when the credits roll, horror realist films such as Threads and Come and See burrow deep within your mind and stay with you indefinitely, and in some cases, for the rest of your life. In the case of Come and See, the durability of the horror is partly due to the brilliance of Elem Klimov's direction, the dread-inducing sound design, and the lead performance from the teenage Aleksei Kravchenko, a performance I'm quite comfortable calling one of the best I've ever seen. However, what gives Come and See its ferocious bite is its firm footing in reality. It doesn't rely on fabricating paranormal antagonists or even fictional villains. It doesn't need to. If we accept the title's invitation, we're shown in stomach-turning detail that there is no monster more vicious than our fellow human. If you haven't seen Come and See, it's at this time that I would urge you to pause this video and go see it. It's available to watch for free on YouTube, and I'll be sure to leave a link in the description. Although Come and See is a tough watch, I believe it's a movie everyone should watch at some point in their lives for the reasons I will be laying out in this video. Come and See takes place in a remote part of Belarus during the Nazi occupation. In many ways, the bloody odyssey our protagonist Flora undergoes encapsulates the vicious cycle of war that has existed from the dawn of humanity. Naive to the reality of war, we watch as Flora digs through the dirt, looking for an assault rifle that will ensure his enrollment into the ranks of the Soviet partisans. He shovels through the earth with glee, like a child at play. At this point in the film, he is a child, and when he prematurely graduates into adulthood, you can see it on his face, a face that seems to have aged decades in only a few days, another testament to the terrific performance from Kravchenko. Through the war waged on his people, Flora loses everything. He loses his home, his family, and his innocence. In the climactic sequence when the Nazi aggressors round up the members of a village into a barn that is then burned to the ground, we're thrown down to the bedrock of human depravity. The invading army laughs, while the Belarusian citizens and their earth is scorched. The nonchalant attitude with which they sow their carnage is nothing short of chilling. Such a knife-twisting sequence and reaction forces us into a confrontation with true evil. Secure in our own morality, the natural reaction to such a scene is to detach the perpetrators from humanity altogether. But to do this is to claim the moral high ground, to assume that all of them are simply wired differently than the rest of us, that they are evil incarnate, even that they are less than human or not even human, but monsters. A lesser filmmaker would have fallen into that trap, but not Elem Klimov. The message I believe he delivers in this film is that under the wrong circumstances, the words human and monster can be synonymous. At the very end of the film, an emotionally withered Flora encounters a framed propaganda poster adrift in a puddle. Prominently featured on it is none other than Adolf Hitler. His comrades are fleeing, marching off towards their next skirmish with the enemy. Instead of joining them, Fliora slings his rifle off his shoulder and fires repeatedly at the poster. Each shot is interspliced with newsreel footage of the Führer, depicting his life in reverse. With each shot, Fiora's inner vitriol hardens his face. Physically, it's a way for him to have some form of catharsis, and mentally, it reflects the fantastical desire to be able to undo and reverse the events that led to the war in the first place. We've all at one time heard or thought about the hypothetical what-if of smothering baby Hitler in the crib. When face to face with the infant Hitler, Fliora hesitates. He chooses to not shoot him. Killing an innocent baby would turn the tables of evil back onto him. But considering the lives that would have been saved, is it within moral bounds to kill a baby? Even if it isn't, is it worth doing in this case anyway? The argument in the affirmative assumes that such an action would have prevented a global conflict spawned several decades later. Can we be so sure that the collective voice of the embittered and the angry would not have been projected through another deranged despot? Arguments could be made in either direction, so we shouldn't get sidetracked in speculation. What I believe the point of this scene is, and why Fliora doesn't shoot, is that even Hitler was once innocent. He wasn't hardwired any differently from the rest of us. He was born a blank slate with equal potential for good and evil, dependent on the circumstances of his life. Obviously, we know which path he went down, and unfortunately, it is a path taken by many. The film's original title wasn't Come and See, it was Kill Hitler. In interviews, Klimov stated that the original title wasn't meant to be taken literally, but metaphorically. Not to kill Adolf Hitler the person, but to wrestle with the potential for evil on the individual level, and to kill the Hitler within us all. With this savvy directorial stroke, Klimov offers a more nuanced view of the nature of evil. Fliora kills his inner Hitler by sparing the infant Hitler. It's in this moment that Come and See rises above the natural inclination to lust after vengeance. Violence and evil begets more of the same, but this scene leaves us with at least an ounce of hope. But that hope is short-lived. Fliora manages to smother his inner Hitler in that moment, but in the film's final moments, he rejoins his partisan comrades and gets lost in the crowd. The war rages on. The horror we witnessed in that Belarusian village was just a single drop of blood in a deep well of wickedness. That village was just one of 628 that were erased by the Nazis. In the same interview, Klimov says that when the film was screened, there were several cases of people needing to be taken away in ambulances. But in depicting the reality of the events, he claims that the film is rather restrained. They could have shown much more, but people wouldn't have been able to watch. Klimov's message of killing your inner Hitler is admirable, and is the chief reason why Come and See is one of the best war films ever made. But it isn't very practical. In the problem of combating evil, especially the evil lurking within ourselves, it is an incomplete solution. It prescribes a moral duty to stamp out inner potential for evil, but it doesn't adequately address the source and the evolution of that inner Hitler. We still aren't clear on exactly how an innocent child can mold into a mass-murdering tyrant. We're left in the dark as to how good intentions and passivity and inaction on the individual level can tolerate and ultimately facilitate evil on the collective level, a key dimension of evil often omitted from the history books. And if we remain ignorant to the forces and natural inclinations that nurture the evil within us, we are far more susceptible to it possessing us and poisoning our potential for good. On the subject of human nature, one of my favorite writers is the cultural anthropologist and Pulitzer Prize winner Ernest Becker. His works have a way of cutting straight to the bone of what motivates human action, and in his seminal work, The Denial of Death, he lays out his poignant thesis. The idea of death, the fear of it, haunts the human animal like nothing else. It is a mainspring of human activity, designed largely to avoid the fatality of death, to overcome it by denying in some way that it is the final destiny of man. With the specter of our eventual demise always looming over us, human beings are fated to search and scramble for crumbs of cultural or symbolic significance. Each human is on a mission to transcend our ultimate fate and achieve immortality through the arts, through politics, through procreation, through charity and philanthropy, and even through acting as a necessary gear in a functioning social system. What will suffice is anything that stifles our existential fears and anxieties and allows us to bask in the belief that at the end of the day, we made a difference in the world, that we had contributed to something bigger than ourselves, and that our life had meaning, and thus denied that death is the total extinction of the self. I think that Becker's theories are quite compelling, but how do they relate to the inception of our inner Hitler? How does it relate to the inevitability of war and evil? Being the only creatures on Earth with the knowledge of our fragile mortality is the curse of our species. Our reaction to that knowledge and our eternal campaign against mortality manifests not just simply in the need for significance, but in the need to achieve a heroic self-image, which Becker describes in his book Escape from Evil as the root cause of human evil. T.S. Eliot once wrote, quote, "Most of the evil in this world is done by people with good intentions. If the foot soldiers of evil act under the conviction that they're working toward good ends, it might seem that evil is subjective by nature. But with hindsight, we can look at the rise of totalitarian states in the 20th century and firmly state that, despite intentions, there does exist an objective sense of evil. A fervent drive to heroism is embedded deep within the marrow of all of our bones. That drive is reflected in all of our storytelling traditions, from Beowulf to Batman. But what every hero needs in order to achieve symbolic immortality is an antagonistic force to wage war against and to ultimately triumph over. And more often than not, that antagonist is another human who is on the same, albeit opposite, journey toward heroism. Every villain is the hero to their own story. Because of this, differentiating between hero and villain can prove difficult. In his philosophy, Ernest Becker establishes a binary of heroism. There is cosmic heroism and cultural heroism. Cosmic heroism appeals to the nonconformists of society. It involves following a personal, individualistic path to heroism that aligns with one's authentic views. This is the system of heroism that Becker believed was more conducive to psychological health. On the other hand, we have cultural heroism. Those that follow this path achieve their symbolic immortality by adopting predetermined social roles and acting as integral gears that keep a system or society turning. Their meaning in life is secured by their contribution to society, a society that may or may not be totally engulfed in evil. Cultural heroism is not inherently evil, but institutionalized evil requires a monopoly on cultural heroism to facilitate and enable its malignant growth. It's important to note that cosmic heroism can also lead to evil, and it's often the cosmic heroes who spark the movements that devolve into systematic evil. But how can the inner Hitlers get activated within the individual who follows a nonconformist path? One possible answer lies within Carl Jung's conception of the shadow. The opposite of the persona, which is the self we project to society, the polite mask we often hide behind, the shadow is the darker side of the self that is fueled by repressed traits and attributes. Most often, these are traits frowned upon in civil society, aggression, for instance. The shadow can also consist of unconscious negative self-assessments that can only breach the surface of the conscious mind in the form of denial through projection. For an example, When someone has an unintegrated shadow, internal feelings of inadequacy can only be relieved when carefully curated scapegoats are deemed unclean and inferior. You take an entire nation that's been throttled by economic hardships, where shadows have been left to grow and fester unchecked, and add a despotic leader with tyrannical ambitions and an obese shadow, and you have yourself a powder keg. Such a leader mobilizes the repressed aggression of a collective shadow, assigns scapegoats, and provides an outlet for catharsis, as well as a path to cultural heroism. In its most insidious frame, objective evil takes the form of a perverted hero system that devalues liberty and the integrity of all human life. Under the wrong circumstances, this form of evil can sweep through an entire nation, spreading like a mental contagion, distorting reality and better judgment and inflaming the inner Hitler or shadow of the collective. What contributes to the spread of the mental contagion, along with unfettered shadows, are low trust in the institutions that precipitated societal hardships and low religious participation. The old methods of achieving cultural heroism have been gutted, and there is no longer the connection with the divine that for centuries proved effective in quelling existential anxieties. A contagious regime of evil fills the vacuum by cloaking their objectives in a pseudo-divine frame. Such was the case with Nazi Germany. Anger and resentment built up and incubated the mental contagion. Scapegoats were labeled and targeted, nonconformists purged, antagonists to the hero system created. The inner Hitler attached itself to a deluded path to heroism, to transcendence of death, and pursued it rabidly. It manifested in the principle of Lebensraum, the Nazi objective to forge the divine destiny of the German people by exterminating the Slavic people like Flora and his family, as well as millions of others, to purge the scapegoats and to clear the land for Aryans to repopulate. Hitler himself described his mission in the East as one with the aim of creating a Garden of Eden. 628 Belarusian villages were burned down gleefully by the Nazis because it followed the course of their own self-perpetuation. Many people fled Germany during the rise of the Third Reich. What I've always found curious are the legions of ordinary people who not only stayed behind but embraced the swell of evil that washed over the nation. Voltaire once said, quote, "Those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities." With the help of Becker's work, we can begin to understand the choices of the average German as a reflex of their denial of death. They work towards the absurd end of Aryan supremacy under the conviction that their contribution ensured them a share of cultural heroism. But how exactly did that death denial equip them with a pair of fangs and a taste for blood? Some insight into that question can be found in Christopher Browning's book, Ordinary Men, which chronicles the murderous rampage of Reserve Police Battalion 101. The men of the battalion weren't young, bloodthirsty soldiers with the incentive of avenging the death of their comrades lost in battle to Soviet partisans. The battalion was made up of mostly middle-aged men from middle-class backgrounds who cleared the Jewish ghettos of Poland and were responsible for the many heinous mass shootings. When the first major shooting took place, the men were offered the choice of stepping out on their mission. Out of the 500 men assigned to murder innocent people, only 12 abstained. Reflecting years later, one member of the battalion who killed up to 20 Jews on that day said, quote, "I thought that I could master the situation, and that without me, the Jews were not going to escape their fate anyway." Truthfully, I must say that at that time, we didn't reflect on it at all. Only years later did any of us become truly aware of what happened then. Only later did it first occur to me that had not been right. At first, it may seem that the speaker is making a poor attempt at evading full responsibility for his actions. The atrocities of the Nazis were, after all, not committed in a prolonged fugue state. Although what must have contributed to the mindlessness of the murders were the group dynamics within the battalion. The inundation of anti-Semitic propaganda encouraged a dehumanization of the Jewish people. They became otherized and viewed as less than human. But even more potent was the urge to conform, to remain in good standing with the group, which evolutionarily ensures survival. Moreover, when part of a group, the individual is absolved of the full responsibility that would ordinarily prohibit them from committing atrocities alone. Insulated by fellow conformists, their inner Hitlers were given full leave to come out and play. What the men were doing did not strike them as wrong in the moment because they were programmed to believe the victims inferior, and after all, everyone else was doing it. You can reason and talk some morality into an individual, but not to a group. When it came time for the battalion to murder again, the vast majority of the men only became more efficient killers. They adapted into their roles, and those who refused to kill did nothing to put an end to the horror. It's likely that those who grew accustomed to the killings had their existential anxieties lessened by becoming the arbiters of life and death, as opposed to being a defenseless victim to mortality. They had the added benefit of solidifying their place in the group and their share of cultural heroism. The nonconformists in the battalion, on the other hand, were subject to constant ridicule and social alienation, both being tools to encourage conformity. The abstainers were tolerated, however, as there was no shortage of men eager to kill. Browning's book delves into much more graphic detail as to the exploits of the battalion. It's a very difficult book to read, but just like Come and See, I believe it carries a monumental importance. Ordinary Men illustrates the unnervingly ordinary origins of evil and forces us to ponder if we have enough moral antibodies in our character to withstand mental contagion and the magnetized pull of conformity. Do we have the fortitude to stand on principle and not just follow the orders of despotic authority? Most people would think so, but the truth is, we don't know unless we're put into that position. What steps can the individual take to extinguish the flame of evil in their heart? Firstly, we can take steps to integrate our shadows. This, however, is not a straightforward or expedient process, but it is a necessary one. As Carl Jung himself said, everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. Integration involves a strict adherence to the ancient Greek maxim, know thyself. Awareness of the shadow and our respective shadow traits is necessary prior to integration. You can't kill your inner Hitler until you become well acquainted with it. But, of course, that's easier said than done. This process requires rigorous self-analysis, the kind that can be achieved by daily journaling and especially by spotting one's own projections. If we find ourselves railing against certain traits or characteristics of others, chances are we feel those undesirable traits brimming in our own unconscious. Everything that is unconscious in ourselves, we discover in our neighbor, and we treat him accordingly, in Jung's words. Recognizing points of projection presents an opportunity to probe into areas of our unconscious where the shadow resides and extract it from the internal world and thus integrate it into our personality. There exists a fountain of potential in discovering and integrating our shadows. Not only do we become more aligned with our authentic selves, but we can also transmute dark traits into healthy habits if we find the appropriate outlets. Aggression into martial arts or anger into a creative medium, for example. We know full well the potential consequences of an unintegrated shadow. Carl Jung believed that the greatest danger facing civilization was not so much the magnitude of our weapons or our capacity for destruction, but our inability to understand our own selves. He believed that the likely outcome from widespread psychological projection on the collective level is war. It's one thing to integrate your individual shadow, but what if a mental contagion has already been unleashed in your society? How do you immunize yourself and resist the pull of conformity that can so easily unlock your inner Hitler? Unfortunately, there isn't a one-size-fits-all answer to this question. What we can say with certainty is that we should adopt an attitude of skepticism towards any society or prevailing morality that projects a portrait of unblemished virtue. No person or movement is without its shadow. In our day and age, we've become more adept at ousting those movements that devalue basic human life. But so have the power-hungry, the perpetuators of evil, who pursue heroism through wealth and power accumulation at the expense of principle. In our time, we must safeguard our institutions and our ideological alignment from the disciples of the religion of power, who peddle emotionally stirring propaganda while wearing the masquerade of morality. We must be especially wary of those leaders quick to label their enemies as Nazis, or who claim their objectives of conquest are efforts at denazification. To conclude, war and evil are inevitable because humans are an existentially insecure animal. All of us actively seek paths to heroism, ways for us to leave a deep enough imprint in the sand to not be washed away by the surf. That feverish drive has equal potential to careen us towards good or evil. While that line is often blurry, there are instances where it is clear. If you find yourself in a society entrenched in evil, you have an opportunity to live up to Ernest Becker's conception of the cosmic hero. You can eke out an oppressed existence by staying silent, by simply conforming. But by doing so, you are abiding by evil and enabling its continuation. You are like the men of Reserve Police Battalion 101 who stood by and allowed unspeakable atrocities to occur unchecked. Anyone can opt to cruise down easy street. The true measure of cosmic heroism is if one can summon up the courage to face the risks inherent to thwart evil, war, and tyranny, to cultivate the virtue of disobedience. In the words of the Russian writer and political prisoner Alexander Solzhenitsyn, quote, "A decline in courage may be the most striking feature which an outside observer notices in the West in our days. Should one point out that from ancient times, declining courage has been considered the beginning of the end. We should not be naive enough to assume that evil on the scale seen in the 20th century cannot be resurrected in our own homelands. We do not want to be surprised to discover ourselves the frog in the boiling pot." In the book, They Thought They Were Free, American journalist Milton Mayer interviewed German citizens who lived during the Third Reich. When asked why German people did not take a stand against the regime of evil that sprouted in the 1930s, one German said, quote, "If the last and worst act of the whole regime had come immediately after the first and smallest, millions would have been sufficiently shocked. But of course, this isn't how it happens. In between comes the hundreds of little steps, each of them preparing you not to be shocked by the next. And one day, too late, your principles, if you were ever sensible to them, all rush in upon you. The burden of self-deception has grown too heavy, and some minor incident collapses it all at once, and you see that everything has changed. Now, you live in a world of hate and fear, and the people who hate and fear do not even know it themselves. When everyone is transformed, no one is transformed."